On the highland plateau, where dry grass cracked beneath worn boots, the man still brewed coffee for two, though only he ever drank it. The other cup, chipped along the rim, rested quietly, like a promise long broken. He sat there, eyes fixed on the horizon, where memories of yesterday haunted him each night. Until this morning, when he heard gravel shifting at the bottom of the dry well. A stranger, face etched with scars, emerged from the shadows gripping a rusted silver ring. He asked for no help, said nothing. He only looked at the man with eyes like fingers curling around a trigger, and from that moment on, the silence between them became the most dangerous sound of all. Part 1. The man who brewed coffee for two, but drank alone. Beneath the pale shimmer of a western morning, when the sun hadn't yet broken past the dusty horizon, the old mail station stood like an abandoned shell, crusted in silence and time. Dew still clung to the porch steps, curling around cracked wooden posts, and the air held the scent of cooled ash and cold earth, the kind of smell only those who've lived long in solitude would recognize. Inside the small kitchen, the soft crackle of fire was the only sound filling the emptiness. Caleb Rowe, 46, hair dark but touched with gray at the temples, sat in front of the stove with the slow movements of a man who no longer rushed life. He wore a worn cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, as he opened the lid of a tin kettle and poured in well water he'd reheated from the night before. Two wooden cups sat side by side on the table, like an old habit refusing to die. One he filled with hot coffee brought to his lips, took a soft sip, and exhaled steam into the morning stillness. The other, never touched, remained clean, dry, and waiting, as if someone had once promised to arrive, but never did. It had been 5 years. The cup had not once met another's lips, but every morning Caleb still washed it, drying it with an old cloth embroidered with the letter M, its thread so faded it was nearly invisible. People, what few had ever passed through, used to ask him why he did it. But Caleb never answered. Eventually, they stopped asking. Out back, an old gray horse stood by the pen. Her name was Dusty. Caleb never called it aloud, just nodded when passing, like greeting an old friend with no need for words. As every morning he dropped a handful of oats into the trough and ran his palm along her flank, not out of care, but because sometimes an old hand just needs something to touch. The sun still hadn't risen fully, but its light was enough to reveal the cracks in the wooden wall behind him. A breeze crept through the gaps, causing the coarse curtain to flutter gently, like someone's breath brushing past and retreating. Caleb stood, picked up his coffee, stepped onto the porch. His leather boots creaked against the boards like an old tune. He sat in the rocking chair, just him, and leaned back, eyes cast toward the faint trail that dissolved into red dust and scorched grass. Someone had once walked that path. Now only the wind remained. Mornings out west didn't rush. They let things happen slowly, like they were testing who had the patience to stay. On the table, 2 cups still sat. One held steam, one did not, and nothing happened. But that nothing was the very reason Caleb stayed. No one needed him anymore, but he still brewed coffee for 2, a way to remember he once knew how to wait. Only now, after so long, he'd grown cautious of even hope. Caleb rose, took the untouched cup, and washed it again. His hand didn't tremble, but moved slowly, like it wasn't just wiping dust, but trying to scrub the disappointment off something long lifeless. The house was silent enough that he could hear the wind gliding over the roof, as if this place wasn't meant for living, only for enduring. When he placed both cups back on the shelf, the cloth was folded once more into a square, set exactly where it had always been. Everything returned to where it was yesterday, and the day before, and 5 years ago. No one came. But tomorrow morning he'd still brew coffee for 2. Because sometimes those who've been betrayed no longer trust others. They just try to keep their own promises. In Part 2, Letters No One Claimed, and a postman with nowhere left to go. After a wordless breakfast with no visitors, Caleb stepped back inside, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp cloth at the hem of his shirt. The house had only one room, 2 small windows, and a large table pressed against the north wall, once used for sorting mail routes, now just a scuffed surface faded by elbows and years. In the corner, beneath a wall bleached by sun and wind, sat an old iron trunk. It had no lock. Didn't need one. No one stole letters from ghosts. Caleb knelt and opened it with one hand. The hinge groaned softly like an old man sighing awake in the dark. Inside, hundreds of letters browned with time, some sealed with wax, some bound with string, all of them forgotten. He didn't read them anymore. He had, once, but eventually the words stopped sounding like they came from other people. They began to echo like things he had written to himself, then folded away. Some were to a mother never seen again. Some from a wife seeking divorce, posted from so far off Missouri. Others from soldiers on the front, trembling script with faded photos tucked inside. Each time he touched one, it felt like hearing the pulse of someone whose heart had long since stopped, which is why he never burned them. To burn a letter was to cut off a voice. And in a dead post station, keeping those voices was a way of staying alive. He pulled out one envelope, darkened with age, creased at the fold. No return address, no stamp. Just a line in faded ink. To be opened when the fire goes out. Caleb opened it, didn't read it, just stared at the handwriting. He'd written it himself in the first year after his son didn't return from the winter escort. The script was clumsy, but it was his, from a time when he still believed something might change. Now he no longer wrote letters like that. But every night he still sat at the table, pulled a scrap from a worn notebook and jotted down a line or two. No recipient, no name, just folded it over and left it above the stove, where the ashes stayed warm enough to preserve a memory no one would ever touch. Beside the letter rack, a faded photograph, old, his wife holding a newborn, standing in front of this very house when it was still new. She wore a cotton dress, hair pinned back. The baby didn't cry. Caleb couldn't remember what they said that day, or who took the picture. Only that the light back then was just like this morning, dim, dusty, and soft with loss. He placed the frame face down, not out of bitterness, but because he no longer had the strength to look for long. Something inside the man who had once ridden horses across 4 states had now curled into a final ember, just waiting for someone to touch it, and either snuff it out or make it burn once more. But no one knocked. The cabin settled into silence again. Outside, breeze lifted a dry leaf past the open window. Inside, the scratch of pen against paper, not fast, not heavy, but steady. Caleb wrote one sentence, folded it, set it above the stove, didn't seal it. And as always, he didn't fall asleep right away. He just sat there, amid the scent of old paper, dry wood, and dim lamplight, awaiting for something even he didn't dare name. Because those who have been betrayed no longer expect promises kept. They only pray. They don't forget how to wait. Part 3, Dried Blood led from the forest to the forgotten well. Midday arrived slowly on the nameless land, as if even the sun grew weary trying to shine through layers of gray dust. Caleb was used to the wind teasing the rusted tin roof, used to the creak of old rope when a squirrel darted along the fence. But today, something felt different. He was just finishing the repair of the broken gate behind the stable. Last month's storm had split one post clean through. The final nail had just bitten into the wood, when Dusty gave a low snort, then stood still, ears twitching. The old mare wasn't fast anymore, but what she sensed, Caleb always trusted. He straightened, scanned along the southern fence where the grass grew thinner and the ground cracked underfoot. Something stained the dirt there, darker than the soil. He squinted, stepped closer. His hand, out of old habit, reached for the spot on his belt where a gun used to hang. Nothing there now but a weathered leather loop. It wasn't oil, not sap. It was blood, dried, dark brown, dotting the ground in broken lines as if someone wounded had limped step by step toward the station. Caleb froze. His eyes lingered longer than they needed to, but his feet moved, drawn by that same old curiosity laced with caution, the kind that once kept him alive riding mail routes through Comanche territory. The blood trail curved behind the stable, no hoofprints, no sounds. Nothing to say someone was still near, but nothing was what made his chest tighten. The wind had gone still. Even the grasses held their breath. Caleb knelt, brushed his fingers across a blotch of still-wet blood at the base of the fence. Fresh. Someone was hiding, or dying, and they were close. His breathing slowed. His head stayed low. Somewhere inside him, some part forged in the years of chaos, the winters that took 3 friends and left him burying them alone, whispered, "Be careful. Not everyone wants to be saved." He followed the trail, past dry ferns around the stone well out back, then stopped. There, in the shadowed side of the old well wall, something didn't belong, a shape not made of stone or brush, but human. Caleb went still. His heartbeat slowed, then surged like the sudden thump of hooves over hard ground. Someone was there, not moving, not calling out, just blood. And silence. He took a half step back, not out of fear, but instinct. His hand gripped the hammer still in his palm. His eyes never left the figure curled by the well. No way to know if they were alive. No way to know if they came for help or brought danger. Years ago, Caleb had helped a stranger, only to be betrayed with a bullet in the shoulder. He'd learned something then. Not everyone who comes to the well is thirsty. He stood for a long time. The wind finally stirred again, urging him forward or warning him back. The hammer felt heavier now, but he didn't step closer. Not yet, because sometimes knowing someone's there still isn't enough reason to go near, especially for men who've survived by trusting no one. Part 4. The Apache Man beneath the well's shadow. He didn't speak, didn't beg, only breathed. Caleb inhaled slowly, then moved forward, boots brushing dry soil, red dust lifting gently around his ankles like it wanted to hold him back or remind him to leave. He didn't stop, but each step was hesitant, like a question without an answer. Behind the old stone well, in the half-shadow of crumbling rock and wild pine, a man's body lay curled, his back pressed to the wall, chin slumped to chest, legs askew, as if life had already begun slipping out of each bone. Caleb stopped 3 paces away, close enough to see, far enough not to be caught off guard. He didn't call out, didn't ask anything, he simply watched. Noon light filtered across the stranger's face, sweat muddied, dust smeared. He was Apache, not young, not yet old. A gash ran down his cheek, dry and flaking. Thicker blood pooled around his right thigh. A deep wound, knife or bullet. His left arm lay across his belly, fingers twitching faintly, still some blood left in him. His right arm was stretching slowly, not toward Caleb, but toward the tin dipper dangling from the well rope, just out of reach. But he didn't speak, didn't plead, didn't even gesture for help. He breathed. Each breath scraped the air like wind through rotting floorboards, short, harsh, stubborn. Not the breath of a man giving up, but of one still fighting long after the battle's end. Caleb's grip tightened on the hammer, his eyes locked onto that fragile movement. This man could be anyone, a renegade, a fugitive, or simply a man dying of thirst. He didn't know. And what chilled him most was the familiarity, that feeling of once lying just like this, years ago after the snowstorm, in a burnt-out post station, alone, parched, uncertain if anyone would ever come. A dry gust swept through. The dipper swayed gently above the well. The man didn't lift his head, but his half-lidded eyes fixed on the swinging dipper, not like he expected help, but as if hoping something might fall from the sky. Caleb took another half-step forward. His heart didn't race, but doubt worked in his chest like a dull blade. Could this be a trap, a lure, a final setup like the one that nearly killed him long ago? The man's breath hitched, body trembling. His fingers slipped from the stone. His arms sagged. Then his eyes opened, fully, met Caleb's. No plea, no blame, not even fear. Just one thing, something that stopped Caleb in place. Thirst, not the thirst of a wanderer, but the kind that came after 3 days in the desert, when your soul starts drying out with your tongue. Caleb lowered the hammer, still didn't speak. He walked forward, unwound the dipper rope, drew water from the deep well. The splash echoed in the silence like a church bell in a town no longer alive. He placed the dipper down, half an arm's reach away from the man, then stepped back, stood still, watching. The Apache's hand twitched. He strained, collapsed, then pushed again. Finally, his fingers wrapped around the handle. He drank, one gulp, then another. No, thank you. No tears, just water. Caleb said nothing, but something in him ached, because part of him had planned to walk away, to leave this stranger behind, to turn his back like so many had done to him. But he stayed, and in the cracked, sun-dried gaze of the man by the well, for the first time, he didn't see a threat, only a man. Part 5. Caleb drew water, but did not come closer. He set down the cup, then stepped back. The dipper was empty. The man lay on his side, cheek in the dust, eyes still open. Not trembling, but not quite conscious either. The wooden cup, that cup, the one Caleb washed every morning, hung from its usual hook by the porch. He had never used it. No one ever had. But this morning, for reasons he couldn't explain, he'd taken it with him. Caleb bent down, took the cup in hand, and looked again at the figure in the shade of the well, still motionless. He didn't know the man's name or allegiance. He only knew the blood on his legs still oozed, and that he was still alive. Caleb stepped toward the well, just close enough to reach the rope. The pulley groaned in protest, the sound scraping the silence like the breath of something old refusing to be disturbed. The bucket hit water, cool, clean, thick with the scent of stone and soil. Caleb poured it into the wooden cup. Slowly, not trembling but wary, he walked forward, 2 steps, stopped. He couldn't go further, not because he feared the man, but because something old still lived in him. A trust that had once been torn apart because someone, years ago, had also lain like that, also breathed like that, also thirsted like that, and when Caleb had turned his back, offered too much. That man had drawn a pistol from under his coat, shot him through the shoulder, and disappeared into the night. Caleb had never told anyone, not from pride, not from shame, just because no one would have believed it. Since then, he'd learned to help just enough, but never too close, because kindness, when recklessly poured, bleeds the longest. He crouched and placed the wooden cup on the dirt a full arm's length from the wounded man. No touch, no call, just gently set down, then stepped back. He didn't do it expecting thanks, didn't wait to be hailed as savior. He did it because he couldn't not. His kindness now was like the well water, deep, cold, and drawn by hand. It didn't rush, didn't spill over. It waited. If you wanted it, you had to reach for it yourself. The man in the shadows turned his head, eyes shifting toward the cup. He moved slowly. The wound pulsed red again, but this time he didn't crawl to the dipper. He reached for the cup, the one Caleb had always kept clean, no words, no gestures of thanks. Just two sun-browned, dust-stained hands, trembling softly, lifting the cup to his lips. He drank. Not in gulps, not greedily, but in measured human swallows. Caleb stood a few paces off, hands by his sides, eyes steady. His heart wasn't racing, but something inside was softening. That cup, unused for 5 years, had finally touched someone's lips. And strangely, Caleb didn't feel loss. When the man set it down, no spills, no carelessness, Caleb saw something small but real. Nothing had been taken. The man had taken only what he needed and placed it back with both hands, carefully. Caleb nodded, just barely. No one saw it. But in that quiet, private moment, the stone of doubt lodged in his chest cracked just a little. Part 6. That night, the porch lantern was lit, for the first time in years. That afternoon passed like any other. The sun sank slow behind the distant ridge, its light fading like an old man quietly stepping away from a conversation. The cabin cast a long, rust-colored shadow across the sand, silent and solitary like the man inside. Caleb stood on the porch, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning what used to be the old mail trail, now just a scar of cracked dirt overrun by weeds. In his right hand was something he hadn't touched in years, the lantern. Its glass was caked with dust. The wick inside had stiffened. The brass rim was chipped and dull, but it still worked, and more importantly, he'd reached for it. No one had asked. There was no clear reason. But after a dinner of leftover cornbread, Caleb had found himself rising from the table, opening the drawer by the stove, and pulling it out. He wiped the glass clean with a scrap of cloth, filled it halfway with oil, and struck the match. The flame flickered, uncertain, hesitant, like it wasn't sure it belonged here anymore. Then it steadied, a small, firm glow. Caleb didn't dwell on it. He stepped onto the porch, hung the lantern from the old iron hook on the beam, the same hook once used to guide lost travelers. The hook held. The wire gave a dry click, then settled. He stood there a moment, watching the flames sway in the evening breeze. It didn't reach far, wasn't bright enough to be a beacon, but it was enough. Enough for someone, if they were looking, to know this place wasn't all empty. Night fell quickly in this land. The sky turned a deep violet black, dotted with early stars. And behind the well, the man still hadn't left. Caleb didn't go to him again. He had done what he could. Water placed, blanket set by the stable wall, bread, half a piece wrapped in wax cloth, laid gently on the porch step. No note, no expectation. He didn't lock the door that night, didn't slide the bolt, just let it rest in the frame, slightly ajar. He sat at his table, wrote a few lines by lantern light. Didn't say it aloud, but something in him was changing. Softly, like a wind shifting direction, or footsteps passing by without entering. Close to midnight he rose for a drink, and as he passed the window he saw a shadow. The Apache man, no longer curled behind the well, was sitting on the porch beneath the lantern. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just sat, and placed the wooden cup before him between both hands. The flame above swayed in the wind. The shadow on the wall stretched long and lean, like a memory that never had a name. Caleb didn't open the door, didn't ask why the man had come. He just stood behind it and let the lantern do the rest. That was the first night in years Caleb's porch light burned until dawn, not to light away, but to prove that maybe he still could open his heart just a little to someone who once made him wary. And perhaps the other man understood, because by morning the wooden cup sat once more upon the porch step, dry, clean, not a drop spilled. Part 7. Meals without words, only the sound of wooden spoons against bowls. The next morning, Caleb rose earlier than usual, not because anything urgent needed doing, but because someone else in the house had already beaten him to it. The fire in the stove still glowed. A pot of water had been warmed, not boiling but hot enough to use again without refilling. Beside it, the wooden cup sat neatly back in its place on the table. No one had said it should be returned. No one had asked to keep it. But there it was, clean, free of blood and dirt. And, strangely, Caleb didn't mind. He poured himself coffee, his hand steady. Through the small window he saw the Apache, whom he now quietly named Nantan in his thoughts, standing by the well, wrapping a length of cloth around his thigh to bind the wound. No one told him how to do it. No one asked him to tidy the spot where he'd lain, but everything had been left orderly, silently. That morning's meal was cornbread, leftover bean stew, and weak coffee. Caleb set the table like always, but this time there were 2 wooden bowls. He didn't extend an invitation. Nantan didn't ask. He simply stepped inside as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No scanning the room, no tension in his posture. Just pulled out a chair and sat. They ate in silence. The sound of wooden spoons tapping bowls filled the space, not intrusive, not awkward, like the slow heartbeat of a home tucked deep in a forgotten valley. Caleb ate slowly, not out of suspicion, but because part of him wanted the moment to last a little longer. He glanced across the table. Nantan's head was bowed, his body was thin, jawbones sharp, hands rough and scarred. There was nothing in him that asked to be helped, but everything about him showed restraint. No one tried to be kind, no one pretended to be friends. And somehow there was no hostility in that quiet. After a while, Caleb stood and walked toward the door, not rushed, not pausing to say goodbye. Nantan didn't follow. He finished his food, wiped his hands on the cloth Caleb had left folded on the table, then stepped outside to wash his bowl at the basin on the porch. When Caleb returned, the bowl was already rinsed, dried, and set upside down in exactly the same place Caleb always left it. No words, no gestures, just enough as if both men had silently agreed to an unwritten rule. Lunch passed the same way, and by supper, Caleb found himself setting 2 plates without even thinking about it. They didn't share stories, didn't ask what kept the other going, never spoke of the dead or the lands they'd lost. They just existed in the same space. But sometimes presence alone is the highest form of trust, especially between those who have been betrayed, especially when no one tries to heal, but the wounds begin closing anyway without anyone noticing when. Part 8. Caleb folded the old blanket and placed it beside the spare bed by the stove. Western nights fell slowly, like an old man easing off a porch, taking with him the last light of day and leaving behind a faint trace of smoke in the air. Caleb shut the wooden door, didn't bolt it. There was someone else in the house now. No names had been spoken, no roles admitted. But the truth sat there anyway, quietly present. The space near the stove had always been used for drying wood, storing buckets and stashing forgotten tools. Among them was a small bed frame, single-sized, wooden, once meant for travelers passing through the mail station back in the years before the war. Dust had long claimed it. and Caleb had stopped seeing it as anything but furniture. But that night, after washing the dishes in warm water, he didn't sit to write at the table like usual. Instead, he climbed to the loft, rummaged through a wooden chest beneath layers of old fabric, and pulled out a thick wool blanket, its edges worn and frayed. It smelled of mildew and memory. It had once belonged to his only son when the boy was small. Caleb hadn't let anyone use it since, not out of sentiment, but because he couldn't bear to share the memory. He carried it downstairs, didn't shake the dust off too hard, just folded it into a neat square and laid it at the foot of the unused bed by the stove. Said nothing, thought nothing. He simply did it. Nantan was sitting outside at the time, tightening the wrap on his leg. He didn't look in, didn't ask, but Caleb knew. He saw. The next morning, Caleb moved through the kitchen as usual. Coffee, brewed for two, eggs, cooked just right, cornbread, still warm. He didn't look at the spare bed right away, not until he passed it carrying wood out back. Then he saw it. The blanket had been used. Not in its original place, but now folded again, centered on the bed. Not perfect, but careful, folded by hands that respected what had been given. No footprints, no fresh dust, only the quiet evidence that someone had rested there and honored what was offered. Caleb paused, didn't smile, didn't sigh, just gave a faint nod, like a man recognizing something new, taking shape between two people who had nothing in common, except that neither of them trusted easily. That night, Caleb said nothing, but before going to bed, he took an old cotton shirt from his chest, folded it, and placed it on the spare bed's pillow. No one had asked. No one would return it. But somehow they were becoming companions. No beginnings, no promises, just the quiet act of sharing small things most others had forgotten how to value. Part 9. A group on horseback came, knocking, demanding a runaway savage. The wind rose from the northwest, carrying with it golden dust from sun-scorched fields. The early autumn cold crept through the wooden doorframe, making Caleb lift his eyes from the fire he'd just rekindled. Out the window, the low shrubs rustled under the slanting light. A single hoofbeat, heavy, close, then another, and a third. Not loud, but deliberate. Caleb stood upright. His hand moved unconsciously towards the rag hanging by the stove, then paused, letting it drop. He recognized that rhythm, not traders, not mailmen, men on the hunt. He didn't call out, didn't glance toward the back where Nantan sat, shelling beans with a small knife. Both had heard the hooves. Both understood. Neither said a word. 3 knocks on the door. Quick, hard, unapologetic. Caleb didn't rush to answer. He straightened his collar, tugged his sleeves clear of his wrists, then opened the door. On the porch stood 3 men in buckskin, their horses tied in a tight arc like a steel trap. Each carried a gun at the hip. One wore a broad hat, pale mustache, and held a gaze that didn't avoid, but didn't need to intimidate to make its point. "Morning," he said. His voice was flat as earth. Caleb gave a slight nod, didn't return the greeting. The man didn't wait to be invited. He asked directly, "You seen an Indian pass through here?" "Hurt. Might have come down off the dry ridge." Caleb shifted his stance, now fully blocking the doorway, not aggressive, not evasive, just there. "Just me," he said, his voice calm, "and the old mare." A beat of silence stretched between wind and dust. 2 of the riders glanced toward the stable, where fresh tracks lay in the dirt, but so did Caleb's own. The mustached man looked towards the back of the house, didn't move, just let one corner of his mouth rise, half belief, half bait. "Quiet place," he said, "easy to hide." Caleb said nothing, lifted a hand, adjusting his collar slightly, but his eyes never left the man's. There was a pause, then a shrug, like he'd dealt with silence before. Still, he left one last hook in the air. If you see him, best speak up quick. There's bounty on him. And if you're hiding him, well, good luck, friend. Caleb didn't respond. A breeze passed the porch, making the lantern swing gently. The same lantern that once lit the way for strangers. Now it flickered in quiet support for a man who didn't belong. The riders turned their horses, no rush, no threats. They'd be back. They knew it. Caleb knew it. When the hoofbeats finally faded, Caleb stepped back inside. He didn't lock the door, didn't check the yard. He simply returned to the stove and stirred the fire, as if that alone was enough to burn off the scent of unwelcome men. Out back, Nantan still sat, still shelling beans, hadn't flinched. But when Caleb stepped onto the porch to set the kettle on the flame, he saw the knife had been sheathed, and the man's eyes, no longer on the beans, were looking directly into his. No words, no gratitude, just a nod. Slow, deliberate, and Caleb returned it, just as slow. Part 10. The man said nothing, but left his hunting knife on the breakfast table. The next morning, Caleb rose with the light, as always. The wind hadn't picked up yet. The sky was a flat gray blue. The dawn light slipped through the cracks just enough to let him pour water into the kettle. He didn't know if he'd really slept. All night, whenever the breeze shifted, he'd snapped awake, listening for hoofbeats that never came. He lit the fire. Coffee simmered on the stove, its scent mingling with smoke in the way only old habits know. He set out 2 bowls, 2 spoons, one for himself. One he didn't bother assigning. It no longer required a reason. As he turned the spoon on the second bowl, his eyes landed on something new. A hunting knife. Not his. The blade had been cleaned, polished to a shine. No trace of dried blood. Its handle was black wood carved with unfamiliar symbols. Clearly a personal item. Clearly valuable. Someone like Nantan wouldn't just forget it. Caleb didn't touch it. He just looked, as if the knife itself was a sentence, spoken without breath. Footsteps outside. Nantan entered, a strip of worn cloth wrapped over one shoulder like a shawl. His long black hair was tied back. He didn't look at the knife, didn't explain, just pulled out a chair and sat, as he did every day. They ate in silence, wooden spoons in wooden bowls. The fire cracked softly, no mention of the night before, no talk of the riders. But both men knew, and nothing more needed saying. Nantan finished first, not hurried, just clean, efficient. He took his bowl to the water basin, rinsed, dried. When he returned, he placed one hand on the knife's hilt, not to take it, but to turn it. So the handle now pointed toward Caleb. A small gesture, but unmistakable. Not a gift, not repayment, but a message. I know you chose to stand with me when you didn't have to. Caleb didn't pick it up, didn't decline it either, just gave a slight nod, the way old Western men do when something deeper than words has passed between them. The knife remained, all day, all night. No one moved it, no one claimed it. It became part of the house, as if it had always rested on that table. In a land where men learn to lie in order to live, placing a knife down instead of drawing it is the finest form of thank you. Part 11. One night, Caleb woke and found no one, only a leather pouch stitched with a bird's wing. The night wind blew from the south, carrying the scent of damp earth and sharp grass. The cabin had settled into silence. Even Dusty, the old mare, had stopped shifting in her stall. Caleb lay on his side, in the narrow bed, eyes closed, but not truly asleep. Sleep for him had long ceased to be natural. It came by habit, not by need. Tonight it came even thinner, Something was wrong, not wrong like danger, wrong like absence, like the quiet had changed its shape. He opened his eyes. The fire had died down. Ashes gray, the glow fading. The oil lamp still flickered low, its flame like a question without an answer. Caleb sat up, pulled on his coat. The dinner bowls were still on the table, uncleaned. The chair by the window was empty. The hunting knife still lay on the table. But Nantan was gone. The door was ajar. The wind slipped through, soft as breath. Caleb stepped outside. He looked toward the well. Only the lantern's post cast a long shadow. He checked the stable, the brush, the outer hearth. No tracks, no sound, no breathing. He turned back inside, and as he passed the writing desk, he saw it, a small leather pouch tied with rough cord. No note, no name, only a hand-stitched design of a bird's wing, done in fine red thread with a care that spoke of practiced hands but of gifts rarely made. Caleb didn't open it. He sat down at the table, stared at it in the lamplight. His fingers brushed the fabric, gently squeezed. Inside was something hard, a polished piece of antler, etched with a single diagonal mark. Not worth anything, but clearly not random. He let go. Didn't look further, because he understood. The important thing wasn't in the pouch. It was in the space Nantan had left behind. The house remained the same. The wooden cup still on the shelf, the knife still on the table. But the air had shifted, as if someone had quietly folded up part of the memory and taken it with them. Caleb didn't sleep again. He sat through the night beside the cold stove, listening to the wind sigh through the doorframe. Not harsh, but enough to remind him someone had been here. No words, no farewell, just an absence deep enough to feel. In the morning, Caleb hung the pouch on the cabin wall, beneath the porch lantern, not as a keepsake, but as a quiet marker that someone had passed through here, been given water, offered silence, and had left, without bitterness. Caleb stoked the fire, boiled water, washed the dishes, quietly as always, but in his eyes, something had changed. And Part 12. Winter came, and still 3 cups of coffee were poured. Each morning. Winter came without warning. On the high plateau where Caleb lived, the wind changed direction overnight. By morning, frost blanketed the porch roof. The sun still rose, but its warmth no longer reached the wood. The well iced over with a thin crust. The horses no longer nickered at the sound of footsteps, and the stove, after so many winters, was lit again. Caleb rose early, as always. He brought in wood, kindled the fire, brewed coffee. 3 cups, one for himself, the old wooden cup with the chipped rim, one for the empty chair, where someone had once sat for 3 weeks and said less than 10 sentences, and one for whoever might come back. He didn't wait, didn't hope, didn't say a name, but his hand still placed that cup on the table, gently, as if dropping it too hard might erase the road home. Some mornings, snow gathered lightly on the porch. Caleb swept it clean, rehung the lantern, the same one that had never been turned off since Nantan left. The leather pouch with the stitched wing still hung on the wall. The cord hadn't frayed. The metal inside hadn't tarnished, even as cold wind slid through the seams of the cabin. He didn't touch it, just looked at it, as if it were a signpost left by someone too proud to give directions. Some afternoons he sat by the window, hands clasped behind his head, leaning back in the chair. The room was quiet. The stove hummed softly, and wind whispered through the hanging ears of corn like someone murmuring nearby. He no longer wrote letters. The shelf above the stove stayed empty. The ink and paper lay in the old trunk, as if their work was done. Once a visitor stopped by, the salt merchant he'd known for years. They shared coffee, exchanged a few polite words. The man asked about the third chair. Caleb said nothing. The man chuckled, half mocking, and made to sit. Caleb just looked at him. Didn't object. Didn't invite. The man rose again. No one had sat in that chair since. In the frozen stillness, 3 cups still steamed each morning, not for ritual, not for superstition, but because Caleb knew sometimes a person returns, not for the place, but because someone once left a space for them. And if they don't return, there will still be hot coffee, still a fire burning, still a seat free of dust. Because in this world, Caleb had learned one truth. Some people won't ask how to come back unless they know they're welcome, and sometimes an untouched cup is the warmest invitation of all. Part 13. A young Apache girl came, returning the silver cup and a short letter. The snow had just begun to melt when the girl arrived. That noon, the sky bore no sun, no wind, only the soft crackling of firewood inside, like the heartbeat of someone waiting for something they couldn't name. Caleb sat on the porch step, a warm cup of coffee in his hands. His eyes didn't look far, didn't look near, just rested there, still, as though the world outside had gently told him to move a little slower each hour. A small horse with dark fur came into view, carrying a girl, no older than 9 or 10, who rode like she already knew the way. She didn't wear bright tribal cloth like stories pretend, just a thick brown blanket, dark eyes like rain wells, and in her hands something carefully wrapped in cloth. Caleb didn't stand, didn't hurry. He simply waited. She dismounted and walked toward him, timid but not afraid, as if someone older had told her very clearly, "The man you're looking for is him." She didn't speak English, didn't nod, didn't smile. She simply held out both hands and placed the bundle into Caleb's. The wrapping was linen, old and carrying a faint scent of hearth ash. Inside was the silver cup, the very one he had once set down in the grass months ago, never expecting it back. It gleamed more than he remembered, but it was unmistakably the same. The lip slightly chipped, a simple spiral etched into the base. Tucked beside the cup was a folded slip of paper, its crease thin, the writing slanted as if scrawled by a shaky left hand. The ink had blurred with time, but the words were still legible. For the man who stood between, no signature, no explanation, just that one line, enough to make Caleb sit unmoving for a long, long time. The girl didn't wait for his response. She turned, climbed back onto her horse, and rode off, shoulders low as if the wind had shifted and called her home. Before disappearing past the pines, she turned back. Just once. The look wasn't long, wasn't deep, but it caught the porch light in her eyes. A thank you unspoken, a return with no promises, but an ending quietly handed over to a story no one had ever promised to begin. Caleb remained seated, the silver cup in his hands, the note resting on the table, unmoved, as if the whole house had already learned to hold tight the things worth holding. By the stove, water simmered softly. He poured 3 cups and placed the silver one in its old place, where a stranger once drank for the first time. No words, no waiting, just the quiet act of keeping what had been returned, a way of admitting that some debts in this world aren't meant to be collected, only chosen to be brought home. Part 14. An open ending, the porch light still burns and the world still holds. Those who know when to stop for others. That afternoon, Caleb didn't light the fire right away. He sat a long while on the porch, watching the last wisps of winter smoke curl around the roofline, like memories too old to fade, too soft to stay. Below the steps, the girl's footprint still marked the damp earth, faint enough to know they'd vanish soon, but clear enough that someone, if they wished, could still trace the path back. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and cold ash into the kitchen. An owl passed overhead, calling once, like someone coughing gently in a dream. Then, as the sun kissed the final ridge, Caleb rose, went inside, and hung the lantern in its place, not out of fear, not because he needed someone, but because it was time. That light deserved to keep shining. On the wooden table, 3 cups still held warmth. The silver cup sat quietly, catching the lamplight, not shimmering, but warm. Caleb sat down, didn't write, didn't say a name. He just folded the small letter, tucked it into the iron chest. Among the letters, never sent. Just once he glanced at the empty chair across from him, not with longing, not with sorrow, but like a man who had at least once been understood. Night fell. No snow, only a cold, soft enough to make a person want to linger just a bit longer. The stars above were sparse, but steady. Beneath the porch roof, the lantern did not sway. And there, in a cabin at the end of a trail no map had ever drawn, a man still rose each morning and brewed 3 cups of coffee. One for himself, one for someone who had once stopped by, and one for whoever might still come, even if only to sit and breathe in silence with someone who wouldn't ask too much. Because sometimes people don't need words, they just need a light that doesn't go out, a chair that hasn't gathered dust, and someone still quiet enough to stay until you're ready to sit down. If this story made you pause, if you've ever walked away unsure you'd return, or kept a seat open for someone who never did, leave a word, not a long one. Sometimes a small gesture is all someone needs to know they weren't the last. We'll read it in silence, as if sitting by that table where the silver cup is still warm and the porch light is still burning.